Welcome to the Eureka Centre, and thank you for joining us for the P Tobin Oration. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that tonight we meet on the land of the Wadawurrung people. The Wadawurrung people are the traditional owners of the land where the momentous events of Eureka occurred 169 years ago. The Eureka Stockade led to male suffrage in 1858, but it was over 100 years until First Nations people were able to exercise their right to vote in Australia. We pay our respects to Wadawurrung elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'd like to begin by welcoming the Mayor, Councillor Des Hudson OAM, Councillor Samantha McIntosh, Juliana Addison, who's about to arrive, I believe, Thomas Keneally, one of Australia's most distinguished writers and public intellectuals. It is an enormous honour for us to have you here with us today. And apologies from Catherine King, MP, Member for Ballarat, Michaela Settle, MP, Member for Eureka, Peter Tobin's children, Marie Harrison, Paula Tobin, Michael Tobin and Bernard Tobin, Eric Howard, AM, President of Eureka Australia. I'd like to remind people to turn off their devices, please. And there'll be no questions at the end of today's talk, but there will be an opportunity to mingle and enjoy some hospitality at the end of Mr. Keneally's presentation. It's now my pleasure to welcome Mayor Councillor Des Hudson to present a tribute to the life of Peter Tobin and to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Thomas Keneally AO. Please welcome the Mayor.
Thank you, Anthony. And I was going to start out by apologising to everyone for being a little bit late, 5, 6, 7 minutes, but it was a really great 7 minutes because we got some really special time with our very guest of honour. So on one hand, yes, we are apologising for being a little bit late and knowing that others were going to join us, but yeah, Thomas, it was absolutely great to spend the last 7 or 8 minutes with you and talking about your career of writing, and I know that we're all in for something extremely special this evening. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Wadawurrung people, on whose land we gather today, and recognise their continuous connection to the land and waterways for tens of thousands of years, and pay, I'm sure, our collective respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to their care of country that will continue for many, many decades and centuries to come. To my councillor colleague, Councillor Sam McIntosh, good to be with you again, Sam, after a busy last couple of days together. And of course, Thomas, having you here in Ballarat is an extremely privilege for us all. And I think that just looking at the car park tonight as we're arriving, I think the name Thomas Keneally has brought lots of people out and have really filled the seats this evening. So thank you for being very generous. For the second time you've actually spoken at this event, I believe, the last time back in the 1990s.
I was young last time.
So today we meet for the 169th anniversary of the Eureka Stockade at the site in which this historic event occurred. The Eureka Stockade occurred on Wadawurrung country, and as we said, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Eureka Stockade is a story that continues to intrigue and engage people far beyond the boundaries of Ballarat. It has had a profound impact on the Australian sense of identity and the very character of our democracy. It's been an important part of our annual Eureka commemorative program, as is tonight with the P Tobin Oration. Many of you might recall and remember having met Peter personally, but for those of you who don't, the late P Tobin OAM was passionate about the Eureka story, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that it was remembered. That was at a time when interest in Eureka was absolutely in decline, but he kept the spirit alive, and there were a small group of people that really were instrumental in keeping it going through many of those years. I remember my time being first elected to council in 2002 and some of the events, and it began to drop off, but I'm really buoyed that looking forward to next year at 170 years and a milestone anniversary that we will need to absolutely celebrate and make sure that the spirit of Eureka is never, ever lost. Peter worked tirelessly to advance the commemoration of Eureka, and through this time he was supported by his late wife, Faye. Now I want to share with you an abridged version of a biography of Peter Tobin that was written and put together by Ron Egberg, who knew of Peter for a significant portion of his life. Peter Tobin was born in 1941. His father, Noel, had been a funeral director in Maryborough, but relocated to Ballarat to assist with the education of his children. After Peter left school, he worked for a short time with solicitors Byrne, Jones and Tawney, but he then joined his father in the funeral business. Peter married his wife Faye in 1963, and they had 4 children, as Anthony said before: Marie, Paula, Bernard and Michael. I had the pleasure of working in Victoria Police with Michael. He spent a bit of time here in Ballarat, and it's great to see former Superintendent of Victoria Police and Area Commander Paul Manane here with us this evening. So Paul, welcome to you as well. When Peter's father became ill, they relocated to the funeral premises in Dawson Street South, where they remained there for 13 years. Peter, with his brother, also operated a service station on the corner of Dawson and Dana Streets. That's an odd mix, isn't it? A service station and a funeral home as being 2 joining businesses. The funeral home eventually moved from Dawson Street to Invermay Park, and this was the fulfilment of Peter's dream, the 7-acre Dufton Park Funeral Centre, which changed the way funeral homes were built in Australia. Peter was indeed a visionary leader in the funeral industry. As well as being a prominent businessman in Ballarat, Peter also had a very strong community-minded spirit. In 1979, Peter and Doug Sarah, together with a few others, formed the Eureka Commemorative Society to promote the significance of the Eureka story. The society sought to correct the historical perspective and the importance of Eureka, to encourage discussion and debate and to honour the Eureka legacy. To this end, it was thought appropriate that a recognisable monument should be built to honour Eureka, and hence the very large flagpole at the Bakery Hill roundabout was erected to fly the Eureka flag to mark the 125th anniversary of Eureka in 1979. Peter was also a member of the Board of Directors of Sovereign Hill and having held the position of President of Sovereign Hill. Peter said that a major highlight of his life was the privilege of assisting in the repatriation of the unknown Australian soldier from Villers-Bretonneux, France in November 1993. The soldier had died at the end of World War I, and Peter and Rob Allison from Allison Funerals were given the responsibility of ensuring the safe passage of the soldier's body from France back to Australia. Returning to his home country, the unknown soldier was interred in the Hall of Memory at the Australian War Memorial on Armistice Day with a slouch hat, a sprig of wattle and soil from the Pozieres battlefield. Peter's passion and commitment to Eureka and his work to ensure its respectful and important place in Ballarat's and Australia's history culminated in the staging of the 140th anniversary of the Eureka Uprising. After it had successfully concluded, he said the society had met all of its aims for the anniversary, that it had aroused public interest, it had stimulated public debate, and it was helping restore the miners' and the soldiers' graves in the old Ballarat cemetery. Peter said, "Eureka must rank in the history of this country and as an event that has generated more myths and facts, legends and information, passion and disinterest than any other events." Sadly, Peter died on the 29th of March 2000, aged only 59 years. It was a tragic loss to our Ballarat community and the Eureka movement. His contribution to our community and the commemoration of the Eureka Stockade in particular is remembered annually through tonight's P Tobin Oration. This year, the P Tobin Oration is presented by one of Australia's most respected and best-known writers, Thomas Keneally AO. Thomas is an acclaimed author of more than 30 novels, dramas, screenplays, and books of non-fiction. And in 1982, he won the Booker Prize for Schindler's Ark, which was made into the Academy Award-winning film Schindler's List, and I couldn't help but ask Thomas about that particular project when we were in the other room prior to coming in. Thomas holds several national and international honorary doctorates. In 1983, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for his services to the Australian literature, and in 1997 was declared one of Australia's 100 living treasures. It is now my great pleasure to welcome that Australian living treasure, Thomas Keneally, to present the 2023 P Tobin Oration. Thomas, please.
Mayor Hudson, distinguished guests, and all the people who are here, every one of you a distinguished guest. I realise that part of the honour of being here tonight is to acknowledge the ownership and stewardship of the Ballarat, Geelong, Wadawurrung people and the Wurrung people over this country. And I think that though we didn't get yes up, I'm unambiguous in acknowledging the never surrendered sovereignty of your people over this country. I live near North Head, which is of Sydney Harbour. It's called Corangle, and there's a Gayamigal elder and writer called Dennis Foley, who argues with me that in the autumn of 1789, up where we live now, there were the entire Eora people discussing the future of the relationship with the ghosts across the harbour with us. We had a lot to be anxious about, and sadly our anxieties, particularly over cartridges, our anxieties about being outnumbered by the Indigenes of the area led to a foolish act by Major Robbie Ross and Philip Gidley King, according to Dennis, of leaving the laced blankets, the blankets laced with material from variolous material from smallpox, cowpox, leaving this out on the beach at Mossman to help there be a biological answer to feeling outnumbered by the Aboriginals. And it was then that the smallpox epidemic hit us. And in the spirit of absorbing the story, I think of what it must have been like to be a member of the tribe here, the Wadawurrung people, when the pastoralists came. There's a bigger shock to come, and that was when the gold-mad whites arrived with their need for pit props and for digging a hole and for totally transforming this country from what was thought of as the ancestors' country, land, terrain here. And the shock that it must have been to be Warang at that time and see virtually from the coast inland to here the terrain transformed. And in the spirit of that, I'm sad that we can't ever access personal accounts of what that was like. It must have been quite shocking, and we, the ghosts, remained, and we're still here. But one of our heritage, one of our dreamings, if I might plunder the word without intending to keep it, is to examine still and revisit still, as I say, a dreaming, the Eureka Stockade story. Now, I have always been interested. I wrote about them years ago when I was looking at Irish convictism to Australia and looking at the crimes of Irish convicts that got them here as an outfall from the social problems of Ireland, which were acute, and of course acute land problems too, just as with the Aboriginals. And I came across a man called John Mitchell, and I've now written a novel on John Mitchell. It was published about 3 weeks ago in England, and it's available in Australia if you're desperate to read it. But it's about a man called John Mitchell who became a famed transportee and a famed escapee from Australia. The people we're talking about were internationally known political prisoners. Thomas Francis Meagher, O'Brien, and they're all friends of the family of Peter Lalor. And therefore, I think the election of Peter Lalor as the leader of Eureka was a no-brainer. He had form. And we were never told that when I was a kid, and I think we should be. Peter Lalor's brother, James Fenton, you probably know, an older brother, injured in infancy, damaged in infancy, spinal and other problems he carried for the rest of his life, and he died in 1849 after the famine. He died in an attempted Irish he died as the result of an attempted Irish uprising at Cappoquin in Tipperary. And he was the ideological leader, the person who supplied the thoughts to the men who were transported to Australia. And Mitchell was one of them. His father was a doctor of theology and a Presbyterian minister in Newry. And he sided with us, the great unwashed, in the famine, and that took some doing. And he lost his repute when he moved to America and sided in the Civil War with the Southerners, with the states' rights people, and defended slavery, defended it theologically, and defended it scientifically, because in those days we believed that the human race had a number of origins, and the Africans had just had a harder time of it than us, and there were many people who sided with Mitchell when he said the African American does not have the sophistication to be a free citizen. One of the men who participated in the uprising, John Joseph, who was a freed African slave. The decision of the American Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case, pre-Civil War, was that he didn't have American citizenship. African Americans did not, according to the Dred Scott decision, which was a decision about an escaped slave in the North, did not have the rights to appeal for freedom like an American citizen did. Remarkably, he was let go by the jury in the Eureka, the juries that decided on the fate of 13 people at a time when Peter Lawler was still on the run. This man, who was tried early in the series of trials arising out of Eureka, John Joseph, the freed slave, the police would have thought they were onto a pretty good bet, you know, putting a black man in front of an Australian jury. And he was acquitted, and all the rest were acquitted. And I think those are acquittals upholding the freedom of assembly in Australia were the most crucial part of the Eureka story. And I compare it to all the people who knew the Lawlers, who were serving time, often life sentences, in Van Diemen's Land. Many of them future famous citizens. Smith O'Brien had been a member of the House of Commons for 15 years and had been perpetually offered political seductions to become minister and assistant minister, etc., and to take viceregal roles. And he was his father, an Irish baronet, and he never took the bribe in 15 years. And in 1848, in an uprising aimed at preventing the shipping out of the Irish famine to Britain, he became persona non grata, charged with high treason, sentenced to death, but then commuted to a life sentence. Thomas Francis Meagher. I knew Ted Kennedy in America, and one day we went for a day's sail at Hyannisport on Ted Kennedy's schooner, beautiful schooner. His young wife, great bloke, he made that huge mistake at Chappaquiddick that led to a girl's decease. That's why he was never president, and why that folly kept on coming against him. My American cousin in Sydney has a political history that always keeps coming against her. Christina Keneally. She never got over those Labor crooks, Abede and MacDonald, that she was saddled with when she was Premier. And they will be the story that keeps her out of politics and keeps her out of, some thought she was a future Prime Minister. And she's now taking it well. She works as a fundraiser for the 2 children's hospitals in Sydney. And with children's hospitals, she has form too, because my brother, John Keneally, was heavily involved in the 2 children's hospitals in the West, which 2 American medical officers off an American aircraft carrier where we landed one day and had a cocktail party of fruit juice. They told me, they warned me that our medical system was very socialist. Well, all I can say is, long may it remain so. And in some ways it's not socialist enough. But we don't see our system, we don't see the intervention. It's one of the big differences between us and the Americans. We don't see government, the Commonwealth, as the enemy. We expect it should provide decent public medicine and pensions and medical insurance and so on. And we don't see this as an obscenity, as many Americans do when their government tries to do the same thing. In any case, I'd like to say that the choice of Lawler at the Eureka Stockade was not a wild chance choice, but Lawler had form. His father was a member of the House of Commons too, but he was elected to the House of Commons as a fairly prosperous Catholic farmer. The figures like him were emerging after the emancipation of the Catholics that allowed Catholics to be elected to the House of Commons. And he was trying to end the tithes that the established church tried to exact from Catholics and from Presbyterians. And those tithes were not abandoned till 1867, the necessity. And there were quite a few convicts here who attacked tithe proctors or who rebelled against it, had fights with the agents of the church who were called tithe proctors. And indeed, in Burrawa, there is a convict's castle of a man who became a great pastoralist and who built a castle. His name was Ned Ryan. He was sent here and very successful, rather like the character Magwitch in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. He is a man who has made a fortune in Australia, but he's not allowed to come back to Britain. But he does, and he conveniently falls under a coastal packet in the Thames and meets his death that way. But Dickens was very interested in Australia, I should tell you. No, we're talking about Eureka, but he did send, he owned with Baroness Coutts, who owned Coutts Bank, and she was an evangelical lady everyone tried to marry because she owned Coutts Bank. I'm sure she was charming, but she never married. She never married, and he persuaded her to establish a home for abandoned women, literally abandoned, not ex-prostitutes, women who had been thrown out of the ragged schools for being ill-disciplined, women who'd been sacked as unjustly as seamstresses. What happened then, men could put the word on a seamstress, and if she didn't agree with the word, she could end up being sacked. Or a man might fall for a seamstress and say, "This is a dress of my wife's, you may wear it." And then the wife notices and expects the worst, and it is the seamstress who suffered that expulsion from the family or the factory, not the wife and not the husband. And so he had a house for women like that, and it had a piano, which Baroness Coote bought for the women to use. And this was considered very terribly progressive, you know. They're not supposed to play a piano. They're supposed to spend all their time reforming. They're bad girls. Anyhow, he sent them to Australia. And then ultimately he sent 2 of his sons to Australia. But back to Lawler, when Lawler arrived, these young islanders who were influenced by Lawler's brother were all in Van Diemen's Land. And the father, as I said, was anti-tithe member of Parliament. The brother, James Fintan, the damaged brother who died in 1949, he had a great influence on these men. And one of them, John Mitchell, who sadly ended up supporting slavery, when he was transported to Van Diemen's Land, he had a newspaper called The Irish Felon, and he depended on a number of men to keep it going. And one of those men was Lawler's brother, James Fintan Lawler. And indeed, a number of the men were arrested and did time for editing The Irish Felon and getting it onto the street. And so did poor old James Fintan. James Fintan was saying, and I should find the quote, shouldn't I? But we have to get on, that he didn't intend to end the alliance with Britain with politeness, etiquette, but overturn it entirely. And he couldn't do that because he was a crippled man, but he wanted the young islanders to do it. In any case, therefore, he himself had been influenced by his brother, and so had these men in Tasmania who were contemporaries in Australia of Peter Lawler. So he was a great fellow he knew what rebels were. He was a great fellow to make the leader of the Eureka Stockade. And Carboni would have known about the Lawler connection with the Young Islanders. They would have all, Verne, the Americans, the members of the Californian Rifles who were in the stockade, but they took a morning off when the stockade, very fortuitously, because I think they would have been a bit dangerous and there would have been more bloodshed. Therefore, I am appalled that because our old-fashioned loyalist history, which was all to make us children of the British Empire, grateful children of the British Empire, our imperial history took all that colour out of Lawler and all that connection, all that context away from him, and just has him as the Speaker of the House of Parliament in Victoria. Now, there is another wonderful figure who came to your state called this is what happens when you get old, you see. You know all the names coming in. Oh, you're going to hammer them all. But then it's the editor of the newspaper The Nation, which published James Fintan Lawler, and he became a premier, not only a speaker, but premier of Victoria. And I know his name so well. Please, someone put me out of... Charles Gavin Duffy, yes, Charles Gavin Duffy stood a number of trials in Ireland for sedition because of his newspaper, The Nation, and in it were published all these radicals and every Irishman you've ever heard of, and of course the beautiful big-boned mother who ultimately became the mother of Oscar Wilde. She wanted to marry Thomas Francis Meagher, who, after all, was condemned to death. You've got to love him, a dandy who's condemned to death at the age of 25, and who makes a speech from the dock saying, "I shall not long detain the court," and then talks for 2 hours. And who says, we don't have freedom of assembly, we don't have the freedom to a jury of our peers because the decision of this court has already been finalised elsewhere. And I look forward, Ted Kennedy had to make the speech when he was a little kid, Ma's speech from the dock. He said, "I look forward to the day when we meet a judge who can't be got at, and a jury that can't be massaged into place, consisting mainly because of Catholic emancipation only just happened. Very few Irish Catholics on the juries, and some of those wanted to show the Brits that they were respectable people too, some of the people who got on juries for the first time. And so in any case, the jury experience of the rebels in Victoria was never reproduced in Ireland. And it fascinates me to this day that we had such a good experience of the British Empire, only had to have one rebellion. And the Irish had such a miserable experience on that, with set up and manufactured juries, juries designed to find a guilty project. And even the Irish nationalist who was tried for killing a landlord's bailiff on our land, and I don't agree with killing landlords' bailiffs at all, but even in Ireland, where they were doing it out of desperation, the man who was arrested for it was hanged despite 40,000 signatures to let him off. And that's some of the history my grandfather brought with him from his uncle and his father's land in this townland called Glenlara, near a town called Newmarket up in the north. Eureka Stockade is the reason we can say we were members of the British Empire and did pretty well out of it. It's a reason why the rebels settled down and became Speakers of the House. And I find this fascinating, that it is Lawless, rebel connections, an ideological brother who died in an Irish uprising, after an Irish uprising in 1849, who laid down the thoughts that many people had in Australia, many radicals, but they were able to become Speakers of the House, members of the Assembly. See, the whole thing hadn't been engineered into place as a system that excluded people. People felt more included in Australia. And that is fortunate for us to this day. And the freedom of assembly for which Eureka stands is very important to us. The bearing of arms into a stockade, no thanks. I don't want to get shot. And I also, the wonderful thing about Australia is our politicians are too lazy to imprison and assassinate writers, and I hope they remain too lazy. Therefore, I'm not a fan of the arms. I'll tell you why, because in the time of the Eureka Stockade, I feel that it is the last uprising of 1848. Throughout Europe, there were uprisings in 1848. Many of the men, including Carboni, including Verne, who took part in those uprisings throughout European capitals, now participated in the Eureka Stockade. William Smith O'Brien, who led an uprising in Ireland, found that he could have an army by sundown, and by next morning he didn't have an army, because the bishops told the priests to get amongst the rebels and tell them they couldn't be allowed the sacraments if they died. Now, to tell an Irish man or woman that is to basically to damn them. So ultimately he had a few hundred people, and he attacked a police force in the widow McCormack's house in Tipperary, and a cavalry division turned up and fought them as well, a British cavalry unit. Not a division, but it was often the uprising that the Irish managed to come up with was pitiful, and yet the men who led them, including Smith O'Brien, whose statue was put in Dublin before the Liberators, before Daniel O'Connell's, William Smith O'Brien, who knew the Lawler family, his statue was put up before the Liberators. Often these men led delusory uprisings, as Emmett did. There was a girl in the village of my grandparents called Sarah Curran, and she was the beloved of Robert Emmett. Often these uprisings were ridiculous, and yet the Irish loved forever the people who were in them, because they saw in them people from the establishment who could have been lawyers, who could have been judges, who could have been generals, people from the establishment who felt a connection with them. And so it is from Eureka that we see the assertion of Australian desires for democracy, and from Eureka we see the happy outcome, the 13 acquittals, the de facto acquittal of Peter Lawler, who was on the run. And I think that's why at 88 I still want to be an old sod who comes down here and gets the chance to talk to you about the Young Islanders, Smith O'Brien, about freedom of assembly. I see that politicians often talk as if they regret freedom of assembly. It is the wart on the buttocks of democracy, but it is our wart, and it's terribly important. And even I feel if you allow people you don't approve of to, which can be a big list for some folk, even if you allow them freedom of assembly gives people a sense that they're being listened to. And let's hope it delays the onset of fascism, not quickens it. I think that the success of Eureka is something we can cherish. And I have to say, let's look at Australian democracy. For example, we had Canadian convicts here. You'll see in the map of Sydney Harbour a place called Canada Bay, because there was a stockade of Canadians out near Concord. What was their uprising? It was about the enshrining of the established church in Ontario. It was about the Tory oligarchs who tried to take over the very earth in Ontario. And in 1837, Presbyterians and French rose up against the English, and some Americans did too, against the installation of an oligarchy in Ontario and the rights of the Tories' favourite hopes. And those convicts were ultimately returned to Canada, most of the French-speaking ones, from Canada Bay in Sydney. But you then get a very interesting governor like Burke, and Bishop Broughton is pleading with him to establish the church and to have all the great unwashed of New South Wales pay for the established church. And he won't do it because he actually corrupts us Catholics along the way by giving us most of Manly, giving the Catholic Church most of Manly. Real estate corrupted the bishops, I'm sorry. And therefore, but we were treated as an endowed church ourselves, and that was a tremendously important to reconcile the great unwashed Irish to living under the crown for trying to achieve a utopia in Australia. And utopianism was very strong when I was a kid amongst all our families, you know. In one or two generations, they went from the labourers to the professional classes. And, you know, what was a bloke called Phil Lynch doing? I have to say that was part of the success of Australia. But I just wish we all remembered how despised our forebears were before we condemned newcomers to Australia. So I'm proud of all the impulses that were in these gentlemen and in the women about whom Claire Wright has written so well. I just wish that we could have a discipline in history, and that is the comparative study of being part of an empire. Why did we get away? Well, we kept on implying in our loyal addresses to Queen Victoria that we could become our own country, not a dominion within the British system, but something like the United States. And the United States people have often, at NYU, where I taught for a while, lots of Irish, and they say, why didn't you blokes clear out the monarchy? And the answer was because it was pretty good for us, actually. It wasn't good for us elsewhere, but we benefited well from distance, and people kept on getting away with things because of that distance. Because you could send 20,000 extra troops to Ireland in the morning, but by the time they got here, the rebellion would be 2 years old, you know. the Eureka would have gone, and you'd be going round Christmas parties, getting inebriated in the colony of Victoria. And I think that distance allowed Australia and Canada certain liberties which we didn't necessarily find in other Crown colonies. And therefore we ought to have a discipline called comparative empire studies, comparative colonial studies. There was a Fenian who was in Western Australia. I don't think I've mentioned him. I did beforehand. If I did, it's purely that I'm losing it. And made for the chopper. But there was this man used to raise money for home rule in Ireland and for the Fenians and could always raise money. I read a speech he made. You notice I'm going to some trouble not naming him. I read a speech he made in Gympie, of all places, and he'd said he'd never seen such a beautiful place as Gympie. Well, and he'd never seen a more fine product of the Irish soil as the people of Gympie, and he'd never, etc., etc. The newspaper in Gympie was run by a bloke who was transported with an uncle of mine, an old Fenian called Flood. And, but this unnamed Fenian said, there is a colony here that has only 50,000 whites, and it has home rule, and we don't. So the question of comparative literature, of comparative studies of the British Empire, even the question of the Tory oligarchy in Ontario, is a fruitful one and a very interesting one. And God bless the men of Gallipoli, of Eureka, sorry. See how they're mythically connected? God bless them. And they can turn in their rifles at the nearest police station. Thank you for having me. We have to go on honouring the heritage of the Tobins in commemorating Eureka. And I'm very proud to be here again. Thank you for having me. And up the right of assembly, even if we do say the wrong thing.